Hi, thank you for joining me. Mindy Mandell here. So each week, for those of you new to the channel, each week I talk about one of Plato's dialogues. And my goal is to show the continuity of thought that runs through all of the dialogues. So if that sounds interesting to you, then I do hope you'll think about subscribing. Now, as you can see, today we're talking about the dialogue Philebus. This is actually the second video on Philebus, so if you have not seen the first one, I do recommend that you go back and watch that one first. I'll be assuming that anybody watching this has already seen that video. So if you haven't, I'll link it up above, and you can always just come back to this one. So basically what we covered last week is we saw that they talked about the metaphysical terms bound, infinity, and the mixed. And they did that in the context of exploring which is the happier life, the life of pleasure or the life of knowledge. And they decided that there's actually a better life that is the mixture of the two. And so then they went on to find which of these two lifestyles, pleasure or knowledge, would take second prize. And so today we're going to go on with that. We're going to start today by looking at the nature of pleasure. So now we ought to consider next in which genus either of these two things, intelligence and pleasure, is found to have a seat, and in what state or condition those beings must be in whom either of them is produced at the time of its production, which is just a convoluted way of saying they're going to look at the nature of intelligence and the nature of pleasure. All of our translations today, by the way, are from Thomas Taylor. So they're going to start with pleasure. They started with pleasure in what we discussed last week, and so they're going to start with pleasure again. Focus on just the last sentence here. Separately from the consideration of pain, we should never be able fully to explore the nature of pleasure. In other words, they cannot separate pain from pleasure. And so here Socrates gives a bunch of examples, things we've seen in other dialogues as well. Things like, for example, hunger is a kind of pain, and then you have the pleasure of eating. Or when you're thirsty, that's a pain, and then you have the pleasure of drinking. And so in all of these cases, we see that these sensations which affect the soul by means only of the body, let us consider as one species of pain and pleasure. So that's one group of types of pleasures and pains. If then what we agreed in be true, that animal bodies feel pain when anything befalls them tending to their destruction, pleasure when they're using their means of preservation. In other words, hunger is a kind of destruction of the body, and eating is a kind of preservation. So let us now consider what state or condition every animal is in when it is neither suffering aught that tends to its destruction, nor is engaged in any action or in the midst of any circumstances tending to its preservation. When we're not hungry and we're not eating. When we're not thirsty, we're not drinking. So a third state. Give your earnest attention to this point and say whether it is entirely necessary or not that every animal at that time should feel neither pain nor pleasure in any degree, great or small. And it is quite necessary, he says. Besides the condition then of an animal delighted, and besides the opposite condition of it under uneasiness, is not this a third state or condition of an animal? Without dispute. So we have a third state, the one that is neither pleasure nor pain. Nothing hinders a man or a human. Of course, here, remember now, Plato often used male pronouns, but everything he says about men in general applies, of course, to women as well. Nothing hinders a person who prefers the life of wisdom from living all their life in that state. In the state, do you mean of neither pleasure nor uneasiness? I do, for when we compared together the different lives, this was from last week, it was supposed that whoever should choose the life of intellect and wisdom was not to have pleasure either in a great or a small degree. And that was the supposition. He must live therefore such a life, and perhaps it is by no means absurd to deem that life to be of all lives the most godlike. Now, this turn at the end may seem a little strange for those of you who saw last week's video, because last week what we saw is they considered, what if they looked at the life of pleasure completely devoid of any of the benefits of the life of intellect? And then if they looked at the life of intellect without any pleasure. And what they decided is that both lives were not desirable. The life of pleasure without intellect means you have no memory of what you're experiencing. You don't even have opinion about what you're experiencing. So you don't even have the opinion that you're enjoying yourself, much less have the knowledge of it. And so they agreed that it would be like the life of an oyster. And then when they looked at the life of knowledge without any pleasure, Protarchus quickly dismissed it, said we don't even have to look at that if you're not enjoying it. That's no good. And so they quickly dismissed it. Yet here, Socrates is reminding Protarchus of that earlier discussion, and he ends by saying that perhaps it is by no means absurd to deem that life, the one that they rejected without even considering it, to be of all lives the most godlike. Well, to understand where Socrates is going here, let's take a look at this word wisdom. Now, sorry, I live in Japan. I almost said Japanese word. The Greek word here is phronesis. Now, phronesis is a word that has come up a number of times. And it is a word that comes up throughout this dialogue. So even if you don't study Greek, there are a few key words that don't translate well that are worth paying a little attention to. And I'm fortunate to know some people who are Greek scholars who are very knowledgeable in Greek, much better than my Greek. And I've learned a little bit about some of these words, and so I will share that with you whenever it comes up. And so here's a case where I think it's important to understand this word phronesis. Now, phronesis is sometimes described as like the turning of the soul, the eye of the soul. It's often translated as either wisdom or intelligence. Unfortunately, translators are not consistent. Sometimes even the same translator in the same dialogue will translate the word sometimes as wisdom and sometimes as intelligence. And so if you don't read Greek, it's hard to follow when the word phronesis is being used. But it's being used here. And it's more like an expansion. It's like in book 7 of the Republic, where you saw the allegory of the cave, there's the description of the prisoner whose chains come loose. They're chained looking at a wall. They mistake the shadows on the wall for reality. But if we imagine one of these prisoners becoming freed from their chains and standing up, this person first is still looking at the wall, but then at some point the person turns and sees the exit to the cave. There's a wide opening with sunlight coming in, and the person wants to move towards that sunlight. Now that turning then is symbolical of phronesis. It's like a growing, if you will, of a sense of what it means to be human. Their sense of self is expanding. It's an expansion from seeing ourselves as just physical beings to seeing ourselves as ensouled, to seeing ourselves as individual souls that have a body. A greater expansion of seeing soul as a unity that kind of overlooks all of the physical realm. Seeing ourselves as mind, seeing ourselves as the intelligible, as self. What is self? That's the ultimate question of mystics, right? And in many traditions that focus on energy, such as, say, some Buddhist meditations or some yogic meditations, the person meditating is asked to imagine their energy expanding and filling the room, and imagine this expansion then of state of mind to go with that energy. It's often felt as an expansion. What they're describing in their own terms and with their own languages, of course, I don't use Greek, but that's phronesis. And what we tend to focus on is not so much the expansion of energy as the expansion of state of mind in the sense of what it means to be human. And so it's in our contemplations, as our contemplations deepen and we have a deeper understanding and then knowledge, and then eventually understanding of that experience of knowledge, then we have a greater sense of what it means to be human. And that is, we can describe as wisdom or as gaining intelligence. That's phronesis. And if you bring that understanding of this word wisdom, then it starts to make a little more sense why Socrates might throw this idea out to Protarchus, that the person who prefers the life of phronesis is the one who is living a life that is the most godlike. So Socrates just kind of tosses that out to Protarchus, and so I'll toss that out to you as well. But we go on then talking about pleasure. In treating of the rise of pleasure and of the various forms which she assumes, it will be necessary for us, I believe, to consider a great variety of things. But before we enter on so copious a subject, we should now, I think, in the first place, consider the nature and origin of desire. So you can't talk about pleasure without also understanding its connection to desire. And what they talk about here, then looking at how desire arises in the body, like the hunger and the thirst and things like that, is they prove that desire does not actually arise in the body, because it shows that the aim and endeavor of every animal is to be in a condition opposite to the feeling in which the body is in at the time affected. So when the body's hungry, it's the soul that desires to eat, or when the body is thirsty, it's the soul that desires to drink. And the inclination by which it moves towards this opposite condition shows the remembrance of a condition opposite to those present feelings and affections. So an infant doesn't know that, but an infant knows that it's hungry, but it doesn't know that it wants food. It doesn't have the memory of eating necessarily until once the baby starts eating, and then it has the memory of that. And so we have to learn that we need to feed ourselves, right? So we learn it so young, we don't remember it. We don't remember learning it, but it is a memory that, when I'm thirsty, I know I should get some water because I have the memory that this is what quenches my thirst. And so we're using that intelligence then, that aspect of intelligence. Our reasoning then, in proving that memory leads us towards the objects of our desire, shows at the same time what is the general inclination and desire of the soul, and what is the moving principle in every animal. Soul, of course, is the moving principle, and it is the soul that has any intelligence. Do you not think that when he is in hopes of being filled, he is delighted with the remembrance of fullness, and yet that being empty at the same time, he's in pain? So what Socrates is pointing to here is that we can have both pleasure and pain at the same time. In such a state, therefore, humans and other animals are at the same time both afflicted and delighted. And it seems so to be. And then there's also the idea of a double pain. What think you when a man is empty and hopeless of obtaining fullness? Must he not in such a condition suffer double pain, with a view to which particular condition it was that just now you suppose the memory of past delight in all cases to double the present pain? Most true. Shall we say that all these pains and pleasures are true, or that they are all false, or that some of them are true and others false? And Protarchus says, how should pleasures and pains be false? So a very interesting topic Socrates is getting on here. It's going to be a rather long discussion because Protarchus is not on the same page as Socrates. How is it then, O Protarchus, that fears may be either true or false, that expectations may be true or not, or of opinions? How is it that some are true and others false? Protarchus says, opinions, I admit, may be of either kind, but I cannot grant you this of these other feelings. How say you? We are in danger of starting a disquisition of no small importance, and it does go on for a number of pages. Socrates says, surely pleasure is apt to arise in us oftentimes, accompanied not with a right opinion, but with an opinion which is false. And on this point, Protarchus does agree, but he says the opinion, Socrates, then and in that case, we should say was a false opinion. But to the pleasure itself, nobody would ever give the appellation of false. Socrates says, you're very ready, O Protarchus, at supporting the plea made use of by pleasure on this occasion. Socrates goes on, do we make no difference, my friend, between such a pleasure as comes accompanied with right opinion or with science, and with that kind of pleasure which often arises in every one of us at the same time with false opinion or ignorance? Well, Protarchus agrees that it is probable that there is no little difference between them. In other words, there's a big difference. And Socrates says that now they're going to consider what the difference is. And so from here, Socrates creates a kind of analogy of sorts, or an extended simile, that the soul is like a book. He says, the memory coinciding with the senses, together with those passions of the soul which attend this memory and the present sensation, seem to me as if they concurred in writing sentences at that time within our souls. And when the scribe writes what is true, true opinions and true sentences are by him produced within us. But when our scribe writes what is false, then what we think and what we say to ourselves is contrary to the truth. Okay? And then he goes on. Acknowledge also another workman within us, operating at that time. What is he? He's an engraver who follows after the scribe, engraving within the soul images of those thoughts and sentences and saying. In other words, these are like the images you get when like the voices in your head are talking to you, and you imagine somebody from your past commenting on something, or you imagine a future situation, building out of that. So these little snippets of thought, or sometimes we go off on a daydream, these are images that follow after the scribe has given its opinions about things. It is when that which a person thinks and says to himself concerning the object of his sight or any other outward sense, he separates from the sensation which he has of it, and views somehow within himself the image of that thought and of that saying. Or is there no such thing as this ever produced within us? Protarchus says that nothing is more certain. Right? So all of our daydreams are built on a certain image we have of ourselves, a certain belief that we have told ourselves about who we are, who we wish we were. Did we not say before that pleasures and pains of the soul by herself arise in us prior to those pleasures and pains which affect the body, so as that we feel antecedent joy and grief in the prospect of things to come hereafter? Very true. Those writings then, and those engravings, which as we have held just now, are performed within us, do they respect the past and the present time only, and have they no concern with the future? About the future very much are they concerned, and chiefly. In saying this, do you mean that all these things are expectations of the future, and that we are all of us throughout life full of expectations? The very thing, I mean. Sayings there are written within every one of us, to which we give the name of expectations. There are. And fantasies also engraven in us. Thus, for instance, a person often sees in imagination plenty of money flowing in, and by those means many pleasures surrounding us. And we view ourselves engraved within ourselves as highly delighted. So there's the example of a daydream. And that often is the case. Of these engravings, shall we say that good men, because of the divine favor, have generally those which are true, and bad men generally those of the contrary sort? Or shall we deny it? I'm going to pause for a moment, just a quick reminder, and something to point out to those who may be new to my videos, that in the Greek tradition, the idea of good or bad, when applied to the soul or to a person, has a much broader meaning than what we tend to think of in our Judeo-Christian societies. So we tend to think of bad as somebody who's breaking the law, or somebody who's lying or doing something hurtful to another person. It does have that meaning, of course, but also there's a broader meaning. It has more to do with being unhealthy or having ignorance in the soul, because, in the Platonic tradition, there is no devil figure. There's no inherent evil in our soul. We're afflicted with ignorance. And so the idea of bad, or being inflicted with ignorance, has a much wider breadth. For example, people who have anger issues, or people who have insecurity issues, they have beliefs about themselves or about the nature of reality, or their place in reality or in society even, that hold them back and are unhealthy for them, that are limitations on them and so hurtful to themselves. They're not necessarily hurting others, though. And the idea of good also has a much broader use. Going back to the Republic for a moment, in Book 10, there was a myth of a warrior who was killed in war, but then he was told that he was going to be a witness to the afterlife and he would return to life. And he returned to life 10 days later and told his story. That's the myth. And in the course of the myth, he saw that people came, some souls rather, came, some from above and some from below, and they met in a certain meadow and they chose their next life. And he found that some of the people coming from above, from the Isles of the Blessed, which would be like heaven, came down and they chose poorly, even though they were supposedly good in their previous life. But they were only good by habit, not by philosophy. The truly good person for Plato is the one who is good by choice, by understanding. So the philosopher. And so keep that in mind as you're reading these, as we're going through these quotes here. So of these engravings, shall we say that good men, because of the divine favor, have generally those which are true, and bad men generally those of the contrary sort? Or shall we deny it? It cannot be denied. Bad men then have pleasures engraven within them also, but these are of the false sort. No doubt of it. Now here he talks about wicked men. It's the same Greek word as we saw for bad. Wicked men, therefore, delight mostly in false pleasures, the good in pleasures which are true. And Protarchus agrees that it must of necessity be so. According to this account, there are in the souls of men such pleasures as are false, though in a most ridiculous manner they imitate, and would fain pass for true pleasures. Pains also there are with the like qualities. Such pleasures and such pains there are. So they agree that there are such things as false pleasures and pains. And may not a person who courts and embraces pleasure at random, pleasure in general, of any kind whatever, may not such a person always really feel delight from things which are not, and sometimes which things which never were, often too perhaps the most frequently from things which never will be, and it must of necessity be granted. Should not the same be said of fears and desires and all things of like sort, that these also are sometimes false? Certainly. Okay, so our daydreams are not evil in the usual sense of the word, but they do hold us back from healthier thoughts, and those are false pleasures. Well, now, can we say of opinions that they are bad or that they are good or otherwise than as they prove to be false or prove to be true? No otherwise. And I should think that pleasures too we apprehend not to be bad on any other count than as they are false. So that's very much like the point I was making earlier. They're not evil in the Judeo-Christian sense of the word evil, but they are false, rooted in ignorance. Protarchus, however, has more of that conventional view, and that conventional view that we hold in our societies today also existed in Plato's day, and we see it here in Protarchus, who says quite the contrary, Socrates, for hardly would anybody put to the account of falsehood any of the evils brought on by pain and pleasure, since many are great evils accede to them from other quarters, Now Socrates wants to dismiss the idea of pleasures being evil, because that doesn't fit his way of thinking, but it's a long conversation. So he's going to push that one aside and just focus on the pleasures that are false. And he does it in this way. Pleasures which are evil, through the evil they occasion, we shall speak of by and by, if we shall continue to think it requisite. So push that aside. But we are now to speak of a multitude of pleasures felt by us and frequently arising in us, pleasures which are false in yet another way. And this other way of considering pleasure we shall have occasion perhaps to make use of in forming a right judgment of the several sorts of it. So he pushed that idea of evil pleasures aside, focuses on the false. Hence we find there are three kinds of life proposed to our consideration. One full of pleasure, another full of pain, and the third was neutral and free from both. Or how otherwise would you determine upon these points? So quick summary of what they already discussed. No, otherwise I, for my part. For three different kinds of life appear to me in what has been said. To have no pain, therefore, cannot be the same thing as to have pleasure. Certainly it cannot. To persons who are said to have a profound knowledge of nature, these persons say that pleasures have no reality at all. So in Plato's day, there were many mystery schools that were rooted in mythology and rooted in sort of mystic teachings, like the Orphic mysteries, and there were many different schools. And so these are the people that Socrates is referring to. And he does refer to them from time to time in different dialogues. He has great respect for them, yet he doesn't see them as philosophers. And so they don't necessarily have understanding of, they may have like be able to tap into certain, they can tap into wisdom to some degree, like mystics today or like psychics today. They may be able to get into a certain state of mind where profound words flow from them, but they don't necessarily have understanding of what they're saying. And so Plato didn't put them in the same category as he did philosophers. He did have respect for them, though, and we'll see that here, that he respects them but doesn't necessarily agree with them. He says, to persons who are said to have a profound knowledge of nature, these persons say that pleasures have no reality at all. What do they mean? They say that all those things which Philebus and his party call pleasures are but deliverances from pain. And is it your advice then, O Socrates, that we should hearken to these persons, or how otherwise? He says, not so, but to consider them as a kind of diviners, who divine not according to any rules of art, or from dialectic, but from the austerity of a certain genius in them, not ignoble, have conceived an aversion to the power of pleasure, and deem nothing in her to be solid, but all her attractive charms to be mere illusions and not pleasure. So this is an idea we often hear from some Buddhists or some Hindus, that pleasure is really just illusion. And it is thus that we should regard these persons, especially if we consider their other harsh maxims. You shall in the next place hear what pleasures seem to me to be true pleasures, so that from both accounts compared together, we may find out the nature of pleasure, and form our judgment of her comparative value. Now the key sentence here is this one. Socrates does not agree with them that all pleasure is just illusion. He says that in the next place what he's going to talk about are the pleasures that seem to him to be true pleasures. And so that's where the dialogue is going. That's where I'll pick it up next week. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Also, you can send me an email. There's an email address in the description box. If you like what you saw, I would appreciate a thumbs up. It helps the algorithm, and so other people will see it in their feed. And also, if you enjoy these videos, I hope that you will subscribe, and also please think about sharing them with your friends. And I do hope you'll join me next week. So thank you very much.